Well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon as we discuss how to navigate the potentially choppy M&A landscape in the UK and USA in partnership with law firm Taylor Wessing. It's something that most founders have one eye on from day one, and a well-managed, well-negotiated M&A process can be the difference between a successful exit and a not so successful one. The problem is the ins and outs of the M&A aren't well publicized, and for those who have been or who haven't been there and done it, it can be a fairly opaque process. So we're going to try and demystify that over the course of the next hour. We're going to dive into the key differences between the US and the UK markets and sketch out the different paths businesses can take. I'm Kai, a reporter at Sifted, and I'm joined by Mark Bahan, partner at law firm Taylor Wessing, Dane Kasai, CEO and co-founder at customer identity verification scale-up and FIDO, which was acquired by US company Entrust for a reported 650 million earlier this year and has done its fair share of acquisition itself. We've also got Cleo Becker, who's the chief legal officer at micro-mobility company Dot, which merged with TIA in January, and Dr. Edzard Rothen, VP of Legal in Europe at VC firm General Catalyst. Now, there's not going to be a Q&A section at the end, and that's because we want you to get involved in the discussion throughout. So anytime a question pops into your head, you can submit it via the chat box in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. These questions can be upvoted by everyone else involved, and I'll put the most popular ones to the panel. But I want to start by talking about what the state of the M&A market is right now. Things have changed considerably on the tech scene over the past few years. And I want to find out exactly how that's impacted companies' buy-side and sell-side aspirations in terms of M&A. Mark, maybe you can give us your thoughts. You advise a bunch of companies on this sort of thing. What's changed over the past 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, hi everybody. I've had the privilege of both. I'm in the London office. I opened our Silicon Valley office as well, and spent 5 years on the West Coast as well. So get a good perspective from both sides of the pond. I mean, I think we're in a tough M&A environment right now, but we're seeing definitely an uptick of US buyers looking at doing acquisitions. I think because of the market conditions that we're in, you know, cash is king and cash is tough at the moment. So I think we're seeing a lot of stock consideration, and there's some particularly US buyers wanting to use stock and preserve cash resources. I think one of the tricks we're seeing is pricing of stock, which people need to think about. So you get common stock at preferred prices. And I think that there's a sort of push, and we'll come back to that, I think, later in the talk, but a real push to use a US style of documents, and for US buyers to really push European companies and founders and investors into accepting a more US style. And there's definitely some nuances there that people need to think about up front.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And Cleo, you mentioned on our prep call that for the past 2 years, you've been actively looking at M&A transactions. How have you noticed things shifting? Is there a difference between the situation 2 years ago and the situation today?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say there is pretty much in line with Mark. It's a state of the market. Access to capital is not what it was 3 to 5 years ago. Companies still want to grow, and I think the easiest way for them to do that is, of course, through consolidation. And for companies that want to conserve the cash resources, of course, an all-share deal might be the best option. So I can't comment on whether they're more frequent in the US or the UK at the moment, but certainly we have seen a few.
Edzard, you oversee or will have your eyes on a whole lot of deals. Is it a buyer's market at the moment? Funding's tight, cash is limited. Does that make things harder for startups looking to sell and easier for flush companies looking to buy?
So I think I can absolutely sign off on what Mark and Cleo said, that the market's nowhere where it's been a few years ago, and that obviously cash is tight, and that I think applies mostly to big and interesting deals, right? So we've not been seeing all too many record-breaking, massively publicized exits. But I think if we talk, in this format more about we're not talking about large cap M&A transactions, right? But more like transactions that are close to the VC heart. So I think while we have not been seeing the record-breaking exits in Europe at least, I think what possibly has gone up, but also double-clicking on what Mark and Cleo said with a certain style of consideration in terms of a share swap more than cash, is a distressed M&A segment where early startups have been merged into growth companies that still had sufficient cash reserves to build out their model and have been able to maybe even at a fairly good price purchase competitors in other European countries or complementary business models to sort of build on their own. So I think in total, obviously, if you're talking about volume, the M&A market has gone down to a certain degree, but I think another sort of form of M&A business has emerged in terms of in the VC space, where you would see a lot of small scale M&A activity where companies have been consolidated into sort of their bigger competitors.
Yeah. I mean, and I think you're definitely right. There's been fewer large deals happening. There's probably been fewer really successful deals happening. Hussein, though, on Fido did quite well earlier this year. I'd like to talk a little bit about how early you began thinking about M&A. Like, when did that start for you? Was it day one on Fido, a decade ago? Did you guys go, this is where we want to end up eventually? Did things develop differently?
Whether a sort of startup that is dependent on venture capital wants to exit or not becomes a little bit less relevant, because it's such a standard thing in venture capital around time frame by which you want to exit. In Europe, you tend to have more short-term timeframes, 5 years, 7 years. In the US, there are more funds where they might have a 10, 15-year time horizon. Statistically, from inception to IPO is about 14 years. So the US model is a bit more conducive to growing successful companies to sort of essentially IPO. Was it the intention from the outset? From the very beginning, probably not, because we didn't even know if we were going to succeed or not. And then this was our first sort of gig and first job and so forth. But as it went into sort of the second half of the journey, we started looking at options and mostly investor-led around what's your exit plan and where do you want to get to. Originally, it was more of an IPO plan, and then ultimately became a M&A exit option.
And that's interesting you mention it's investor-led. Is that been your experience, Cleo? Are investors the driving force behind these transactions?
Not necessarily. I think, of course, investors do want to have a view to what the exit might be. But of course, the other drivers continuing to operate the business and grow. So that comes from the founders as well.
Does it help? Sorry, Mark, you were about to chime in.
No, and I was going to say it's worth, for people preparing for an M&A scenario, because it's really interesting hearing from Hussein and Cleo on that there can be a tension there between obviously what the founders want and what the investors want. And sometimes the founder may feel that they want to continue the business. And we're seeing that more in European companies, where you may start to see that tension in the board between the founder and the investor. And to the extent that can be thought about up front and you have alignment in that, I think it can really help with a successful exit and process.
How do you mediate that tension, Mark?
Well, I mean, I think the best way to mediate that, the tension there, and we'd love to hear from Hussein on that as well in a moment, is to have that alignment on what a price looks like, on what the role of the founders on an ongoing basis is going to be, and to try and have that sort of early alignment with the board. I mean, ultimately, if you can't manage the tension, there will be contractual recourses in the articles, in the bylaws of the company, which will sort of tell you what the power group would be in forcing a sale. But that's not a scenario a buyer or a seller likes. So I think it is around that sort of managing that from a very early stage.
There's awareness.
Yeah.
I guess what Mark is saying is that if there's no agreement, you just default to a traditional cowboy shootout and see who makes it. But so in my case, I didn't want to sell. We were at the beginning of our journey. But the point with it being investor led is that it's not necessarily, or often it can be independent of the company performance or the potential for growth. Because if the funds contractually have a 5-year or 7-year period by which they need to return funds to their LPs, it's irrespective of how well the company is doing, they have to stick to that timeline. Now, normally, what could help is facilitating a secondary option, whereby essentially you get those specific funds to essentially sell out and everyone's happy. But the boom and bust cycles that we have creates kind of a dynamic that if most of your investors think that you're in a boom period in the economy, and therefore that by definition there's going to be a bust, then they all, or majority, will be much more inclined to push a company to prematurely sell, knowing that the music's going to stop, and in a musical chair setting, they don't want to be left without a chair. And this is another example where if you're at the behest of boom and bust markets and like investors, regardless of your performance and regardless of how much scope you feel that there might be to grow, an investor decision may well be to sell, whether that's premature or not.
Edzard, how do you communicate that to a founder when, as a VC, you decide, we need to return some funds, we'd like an exit to happen soon? A founder doesn't necessarily want that. How do you go about managing that?
So fortunately, I've not been subjected to such a situation. So I think with all the funds I've worked with in the past, my tenure in VC, there was always a rather good relationship among the investor representatives and the founder. I also, double-clicking on what Hussein said, if there's one specific investor that needs to pull out and return funds, then I think it makes far more sense if the company's has good traction to just sell off the single position and not push for an entire exit. Because I mean, we'll get to this, I think, later about how tedious of a process this is. So if I imagine a group of investors forcing a founder to speak with an investment bank and ramping up a whole exit process, that does not go well if everybody's not at least sort of aligned on the general principle of selling. So I mean, there's obviously always things to discuss in economic terms, but I think if there's a big fight about selling or not selling, I cannot imagine this going well against the will of a founder. So obviously, if it's a bubble or bust situation, then I do understand the tension, but so far we've fortunately not have had to deal with this, with fighting a founder over him having to sell.
Well, long may that continue. Cleo, how did you know it was the right time for a merger? Like, what were the signs that made you go, yeah, this is the right call at the moment?
I can't go into specific details, but I think the thoughts were we'd be stronger in combining forces. So that was the main logic for it, than if we were to continue to operate individually.
Can you share anything else about like the certain kind of like the market situation that led you to go, doing it together is better than doing it alone?
Yeah, I think it's what we said at the beginning of the call. The access to capital for any business. We're in an asset intensive business, and the access to capital is reduced. So I think that's why we thought consolidation and creating some synergies and efficiencies might be a better path using inorganic growth.
Yeah, makes sense. And Hussein and Photo went down the M&A route. Had it been a different time, had the market been different, an IPO could have been an option too, right?
Yeah, at the outset, it was very much an IPO plan. In order to IPO, you kind of need a market that is conducive to an IPO. We also need the company performing at a good growth rate, and so both of those are needed. and in the absence of that, it's typically has to be a trade sale.
Yeah, I mean, and I would add, I mean, I think the percentage of exits that end up as an IPO, particularly of UK European companies that IPO in the US, is tiny. Frankly, we could probably name them on this this call. So it's a great aspiration, and some companies will make it. And Fido is clearly a rock star company. But I think for founders, it's likely to be M&A that the exit is, even if you have that aspiration to IPO.
Yeah, makes sense. And just a little note to Hussein, fire away.
On the aspiration, and one of the things that's different in the US, it's more common to celebrate in the US if you've acquired a company, but whereas in Europe it's more of a celebration when you sell your company, and that in itself tells you a lot about the aspirations of like our American cousins versus ours. In that, why aren't we the ones doing that, acquiring? What is it that we don't have that there exists in the US? This is one of the things that would be nice to see a bit of a change in the coming years.
And that brings us quite nicely onto looking briefly at the buying side. If you're a company looking to acquire another, what sort of thing are you looking for? This will depend on what your company is looking to, whether you're looking to grow vertically or horizontally. But what signs do you look for that a company is up for being acquired? If there are founders of businesses on the call who are in the position of thinking, we could go down the getting acquired or merging route. What sort of signs, Cleo, would you look for in a business?
If we were looking to acquire?
Yeah.
Probably things like, complementary footprints, cultural similarities, what synergies could be made between the two companies, something along those lines.
What's a red flag?
Those come up in due diligence.
Yeah.
There could be many examples of red flags. Big claims, things that could wipe a company out. That one comes to mind. Yeah.
Are there any common ones that you've seen in your time looking at M&A? Like, are there any kind of clear themes of?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about US versus UK, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think one of the differences in the DD when it comes to litigation and looking at claims is given the US approach to punitive damages, where they have these mega claims are actually a reality. Coming at it as a European lawyer, if someone was to approach you and say, someone spilled coffee on their lap and they're claiming $5 million or euros, you'd laugh. You would think that's never going to happen, but it's a reality in the US. So I think when it comes to DD on US firms, things that we saw sometimes, being in a B2C industry are very big inflated claims, and you as the European lawyer might struggle to assess the merits of the claims, because you can't fathom how they could ever be awarded by the courts. So I think that's a big difference. And because it's such a reality for these companies, I think in the DD process, you can really struggle, because getting visibility of the actual merits from the other company can be difficult. They're often afraid to disclose a lot to you because they're worried it will destroy their protection under privilege.
Mark, you must see red flags galore overseeing all of this, all of these processes. What are the key ones for you?
Well, I mean, Cleo summarized it well, so I'd echo much of what she said. I mean, I think who your buyer is hugely important in framing that for a founder from a red flag. If you've got private equity as opposed to one of the big tech companies, to an emerging tech company, to more of a deal which we were talking about earlier around maybe venture your venture investors, which we're seeing increasingly putting you together with another portfolio company to sort of make something even better and bigger and stronger. So the red flags will vary hugely in those different processes. But speaking more generally, I mean, I think generally people want to see founders and key employees bought into the business in the long term. And so I think if the people are important, a buyer is going to want to know up front, particularly, you know, the larger US tech buyers, that founder team is bought in, key employees are bought in, how they're incentivized, that they want to be part of the deal. I mean, I think the two things, if we've got companies getting ready for sale, IP ownership, you know, we're in the tech space here, and so expect to have every stone overturned around, do you really own your IP? Does anyone else have rights to it? Could there be litigation against it? You know, you can imagine that even if people wouldn't litigate against a small company, they would against Google if you got acquired by one of the FANGs and the big companies. So I think IP is crucial. And just getting your cap table, ownership, stock options, you'd be amazed at how many deals there are real challenges from that perspective.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, that kind of brings us quite neatly into looking at how a company can best manage the M&A process. And I think what a lot of founders will have been through is a funding round. But Hussein, you were saying that the due diligence process for an acquisition is totally different from a funding round.
Correct, in that for the most part in the funding round, you get a term sheet, you get sort of accepted. Maybe there's 20% due diligence at the outset, and then 80% of it happens after that until sort of final signatures. But in an M&A deal, it's principally maybe all of it, 95, maybe 100% of due diligence is ahead of time before something is signed. We were quite lucky to work with some of Mark's colleagues over at Taylor Wessing, and it's a number of months on a M&A deal. It takes quite a bit of time, and that's only fair and proper. If the deal is large, if I were an investor, I'd want to make sure everything is sort of every stone is turned. So that's typically the norm. Another part of the difference with raising from US funds versus European or UK ones are, in the US, you tend to have a pretty detailed term sheet, and then kind of the lawyers do the work afterwards. It's all sort of laid out at the outset in the term sheet. You can just get back into focusing on the work, and you don't have to worry about negotiating too much. Whereas in Europe, it can be a lighter, plain vanilla term sheet, and then the fighting begins afterwards. In that, you know, the long form documents, you know, this is what was meant, or we were vague on this, or it was like absent in the heads of terms, but in the long form, this is what was meant, which is not productive. It's sort of the US habit is a better one.
And how long did Onfido's acquisition process take?
Pretty much 6 months to shortlist the sort of highest bidder buyer, and then another 3 months post signing on due diligence.
Yeah. And Cleo, does that chime with your experience merging with Tier?
Yeah, you mean in terms of the differences, because I think, you know, any startup is very used to the funding process, can be done very quickly with a limited amount of people involved. And once it's done, the good thing is that then it's finished and there's nothing else to do. Unfortunately, the same doesn't apply to M&A. You know, like Hussein said, it's a much broader due diligence. It's also a huge group of employees and stakeholders you have to bring in. With funding, we get by, you know, with legal, finance, the founders, and maybe some corporate strategy people. It's a small group. When we start looking at M&A, because we're looking at these business synergies, we have, you know, stakeholders from every part of the business involved. It's not just on the DD, it's on, you know, the integration plan that follows. So there's much more of also a human element to the M&A, because with funding, people are happy because money is coming in, their jobs are safe. And when you're dealing with an M&A, you have to really make sure you have the buy-in from the stakeholders to make sure the deal is a success. Because if people have this conflict because they're worried about their jobs, that can really, really delay the process dramatically.
And who are the key stakeholders? Who do they tend to be?
Well, for us, it was people from each vertical of the business and potentially additional people in their team. And that really also, I think, makes it tough, because these people are, you know, they're trying to operate the business at the same time as they're trying to work on this complex transaction.
Do you see that, Edzard? Is that a common issue at the companies that you're working with?
So I can't speak to a certain example, but just so you know, jogging my memory. Obviously, I mean this. It is tough. I think adding onto the piece of M&A deals, especially if you're on the sell side potentially, then obviously leakage in terms of press and the wider organization knowing what's happening, especially if the deal is not sealed, but you're looking at several options, of which all could fall flat in the end, is very difficult. So I think the teams that do manage the process on the inside of the company, hand picking them is of the highest importance. And then obviously they have a absolutely crazy job to do, and it goes on for weeks and weeks and months. So it's absolutely crucial to have the right people. And then on the other hand, if you do the due diligence and you have to disclose every single little bit of the business, it's also very important to have the right people there so you don't forget anything, right? So you have everybody from the most critical departments who you can ask, so you don't have any sort of gap or surprise come up in the DD or after closing that could lead to warranty breach claims or whatever it is. So it's very important to have good people on the team to manage the M&A process and DD, and they will work full time on this next to their usual job. So obviously you see that on funding rounds, right? That if you have a growth round that goes on with negotiations for weeks and weeks, that people actually have to run a company with 1,000+ employees on the side. But those things usually tend to be a little bit faster and easier than an M&A round. So it's difficult. Can't say it another way.
Yeah, makes sense. Just a reminder to our attendees that if you've got any questions, do feel free to submit them via the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. But Edzard, I want to just touch on something you mentioned there, which is the makeup of the team. Like, does a company need to hire for new roles when they're going through or looking to sell their company? Are there specific hires that companies need?
Well, when you're looking to sell and it's sort of imminent, then it's probably the wrong time. But ahead of selling, and I don't think you would hire people with the intent to sell, but just to sort of professionalize the business to either grow further and become a bigger and bigger in whichever respect, or to then have a cleanly set up operation that you can present to whomever. Then this applies the same way to growth rounds. So if you're looking at a growth investor who's paying a very high price tag and putting in significant amounts of money, as opposed to like a single-digit million seed or pre-seed round, you will have to have a CFO with a proper finance department, and you will have to have a good operations team, and just in general good people along the whole course of the business, also on the technical side, to present the company in a proper way. And I mean, obviously the pinnacle of all this would be an IPO. So if you want IPO, you need all hands on deck and the best hands on deck. But I think it similarly applies to any sort of exit where you would conduct a vendor due diligence in a proper way, without the risk of having issues during the negotiations in closing or even afterwards with post M&A litigation. And obviously, since these people have not been named, chief legal officers, general counsels are obviously people who are highly involved and who are doing at best a very, very important job on the deal.
Yeah, and that's the internal side of things. The external side of things as well, and I think I'm going to exclude Mark from this question because I think I know what he'll say. Hussein, what outside parties do you need to involve when you're looking at M&A?
That was me.
That's you.
So a banker typically. So we shortlisted a few, and they shared their approaches, and that's it. Some analysts might help in that. What are the trends? That's more like a messaging exercise. And if you wanted to work ahead of time to commission those who come and assess the technology, can be consulting firms or specialists to do a bit of a deep dive. All that can help.
Yeah. How do you find those bankers? How do you get in touch with bankers?
in all likelihood, at this point, they would be in touch with you. But you do create a little bit of a, you want to get to know them, and then you have them come and present and essentially discuss their strategy for how they would present you and who they would present you to, and what the process looks like. So we shortlisted Goldman's and Morgan Stanley, and then we ended up going with Morgan Stanley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was it about? Can you share anything about that? What was it about Morgan Stanley which stood out to you? Like, what are the key attributes that you were looking for here?
They were both pretty good. It's just the team at Morgan Stanley had more experience and recent experience of our profile of company and selling it. And that just seems to have done a bit more work around how they would pitch us and so forth. And their fees are handsome. But having gone through the process, I can see why it is as such, because they do a really good job of putting you in the best light.
Cleo, how did you decide which external parties to work with, and which did you work with when you were merging with Tier?
Yeah, I think on the Tier dot side, both parties had advisors. On the Tier side, they had some consultants working on the finance side, and both of us had law firms. Well, how we chose our law firm is we needed a firm which had international reach, because there were so many countries involved and it was a cross-border transaction. You just don't have that kind of expertise in-house. So going back to this thing I said about, we go through the fundraising all the time, so we know how to do it. But when you do the M&A for the first time or the second time, you have no idea. You have to rely on external advisors that do this every single day. So the firm that we went for had expertise. We're headquartered in the Netherlands, and they had offices in the Netherlands and Germany, and presence in almost every single country where there are subsidiaries we're looking at. I think in terms of how we work with them, one of the best things I think about the external advisors in an M&A deal, apart from their knowledge, is when these deals drag on and on, we certainly felt the deal fatigue. And I think what I noticed from the law firms is they really keep the momentum on the deal, and they help, when you maybe have given up, they help bring things to a close. So that was the benefit I found from the external advisors we work with.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think there's a really interesting point there around this international reach, and when you're dealing with different sets of consultants and different sets of advisors cross border. Mark, what are some of the challenges that can come up
from a cross border perspective?
Yeah.
Well, I think, one of the challenges we're seeing a lot at the moment is just in the whole competition, antitrust, CFIUS in the US, National Security and Investment Act in the UK, and there's equivalent regimes across Europe now. So there's a lot of, if you're doing buy or sell side, and it's crucial to think up front on what could be the long pulls, but we're seeing increasing challenges on that front that need to be thought through. It is worth some planning on that front, particularly if you've got a US buyer that's likely to be caught or on the radar of regulators, if you are in that privileged position of engaging in that regard. Looking at it from a US buy side perspective, if you are a company like Clio with multiple jurisdictions, there'll be a whole bunch of just quirky, annoying issues. Probably none of them in their own right will be a deal breaker, but the number of issues, local employment issues, local issues around permanent establishment tax issues, now they will pop up, and in trying to manage an M&A process, and you've heard from Hussein and Clio and Edzard of just how involved a company needs to be and how many people need to be involved in order to provide the information, and actually trying to manage small issues that are popping up in smaller jurisdictions really needs some thought and planning up front. And what I'd say on some of the comments, which I completely agree with, about how many people and needed to make an M&A transaction happen, you've quite often got an umbrella of confidentiality in certain aspects. You don't necessarily want to tell everybody in the company too early that you're selling. And, there's the concept of, you've heard from Cleo, people feel unsettled. People don't know what it means for their jobs, their livelihoods, their stock options. Right? So actually, you may want to be keeping it in quite a tight group for a period of time. And that needs to be managed hugely carefully as well, where you've got the pressure of providing information that maybe in the short term only a smaller group of people you can share it with. And that magnifies when you're doing things on a cross-border basis.
I think that's a really interesting point, is about how you communicate this internally, and it speaks to a question we've had from Dan Fahini, who says, if an M&A transaction can take up to 9 months, how does a seller's leadership keep the in-house team discreetly confidential without losing momentum and focus? Loose lips sink ships. Edzard, how should a company manage this?
So, I mean, the people involved, especially the founding team, sort of has two issues, right? They have to keep this contained. Nobody is supposed to know, but also they can't really dedicate all of their time to the process, because the business needs to keep running for it to be sold properly, right? So if somebody would just get their hands off the wheel and just deal with this all the time, then the company would not be in a good spot when it's then actually is being sold. So I think it's fair to say to do things as you would usually do when it comes to delicate topics, to do it on a need-to-know basis. And obviously it's very difficult, because to a certain degree people will work on a deal and there will be delicate questions concerning their own position where you would need to call them out. So it is, I think, a very difficult exercise for people to go through if they have a very tight-knit team, where you either need to be united front and negotiate as such, or where you need to then look at this with surgical precision and need to keep people looped in and out where they need to be looped in or out respectively. So, but sort of double clicking on what Mark said, while it does take quite a few people to deal with this process, it's also, on the other hand, smart to keep that number as high as necessary, but as low as possible, I think.
Hussein, how did you manage the process on FIDO? How did you keep enough people informed while making sure that nosy journalists like myself weren't abreast of what was going on?
So it's important to have a culture of trust and transparency. You can also talk about a buyer and put a project name around it without specifying the name of the buyer. So that the name of the buyer and the price that they're paying and the timelines, all that can be kept confidential till very relatively late stage. And that's more or less it. It's close-knit team of trust where, as you explain to the company, there's a sale process, and you have projects whereby due diligence and teams go and present, but being mindful that when it's a few hundred people, even inadvertently, sometimes things can leak. Journalists can be very creative with their methods, and just some basic training and a good culture should hopefully see you through it.
When did you tell the wider team that a sale had been agreed, and who it was?
The sale had been agreed was probably 2 months before it actually sold. The final thing was signed, and the day it was signed, the day before it was signed, it's when it was sort of disclosed, but then the press came soon afterwards.
Yeah. Cleo, similar experience for you at DOT?
Yeah, well, it was a merger, so obviously we couldn't keep the name of the other party confidential. But we tried to have as small of a team as possible, and in the legal team we really kept control over the data rooms, the documents, and who had access to them, making sure people know what their obligations are. We disclosed it when we had certainty on the deal terms and that this was actually going to be closed, after getting the necessary approvals from our works council. So that was about, I think, a month out from signature.
Yeah, Yeah, makes sense. And we've had another question come in over the Q&A box, which essentially asks, what would you change about M&A processes that you've been involved in? What mistakes did you make, or what would you do slightly differently? Hussein, you've been involved in some on the buy side, sell side. What are the mistakes you've made in the past?
So not to sell is one thing. Most people would say in a recession you try not to sell and you wait for the good times to come back. So that's the first thing, like get the timing right. When we have done a few acquisitions, so I was only involved with the first, not the last two. The first one was an acqui-hire. It was a team of about 45 engineers based in the US. And that was really good because we knew what the outcomes were. We needed engineering based in the US to sign some US banks. And end to end, it was just a complete success. The second acquisition wasn't as much of a success, and that's partly because I'd say it wasn't crystal clear what goals there were and what the outcomes were and how one would measure those outcomes. And so I would be very, very specific about what is it going to be the material dial? What is that you're going to measure and would want to improve on? By how much would you want to see an improvement to make this whole thing worthwhile? And then ensure that everyone's aligned to that and everyone accepts that that is possible before proceeding with a deal, despite there being a good valuation or good timing or whatever that is. Just because startups, even at a later stage, need to be hyper-focused. And there needs to be a very, very strong and good case for there to be M&A activity on like a startup scale-up buying another company. Most of these scale-ups are like loss-making. So you're a sinking ship. You rarely succeed by, tagging along another sinking ship. If the other ship is looking to sell, then they're probably sinking faster than yours. So you really have to make a very solid case for why you ought to make that happen. The dots examples are perfect. It made perfect sense. Some of the other examples usually don't make as much of a good sense.
Yeah, for sure. Cleo, mistakes?
I wouldn't like to say the mistakes, but the lessons learned. I think if every single time you do something, you learn how to go quicker. And in these transactions, speed is key. So many things learned on how to go quicker through DD, how to build a data room like in an hour, well, maybe in an hour if we're lucky. All these things that are small that you figure out each time you look at a transaction. That would be what I'd say is the focus.
And Mark, what are the key things that you see companies slip up when they're managing the M&A process? What are the mistakes you see?
So, a point Hussein made at the start of the call, particularly where you've got a US buyer, is the importance of the term sheet letter of intent. Depending on which side of the pond you're on, you'll call it something slightly different. And actually, it is. We have seen numerous occasions where people have not treated that with the thoughtful regard that it requires, and you're on the back foot. So, quite often professional advisors, I think lawyers should, we'd love people to use Taylor Westing, but whichever law firm you're using should be involved at that sort of early stage. If you've got bankers, if you've got other advisors, a US buyer will be very sophisticated in negotiating a term sheet. They will have a whole bunch of points that they want to get, and actually, depending on where you land on style, choice of law, whether it's an insured deal, maybe come back to the moment. I think that is a real focus. Insurance actually is another one that we're seeing. A large proportion of deals insured, and what that means is that the founder team and the sellers can walk away sometimes with a $1, £1 liability cap, but they are things that really do need to be agreed up front. You're not going to roll a buyer who's agreed a term sheet into rep and warranty or warranty and indemnity insurance, again depending on which side of the pond you're on, unless you've been really thoughtful about that up front. So I think for me, it's ducks in a row in negotiating the best deal that you can at an early stage, and I think that's probably the most common challenge that we've seen companies have.
There are specific terms that UK founders need to be aware of when selling into the US, Edzard?
I think, I mean, this would probably be the moment where we can discuss in general, right, the key differences between a UK and US deal. So it's not that I would warn a UK founder to look out for something specific in the US, but you know, there are quite a few differences in the process. And in regard of terms, a thing that comes to mind where the market in the US is slightly shifting towards what is standard in Europe would be pricing adjustment, right? So in Europe or the UK, I think it's pretty standard to have a thing called lockbox mechanism where you sort of agree on a certain valuation of the asset, and then you have adjustment mechanisms that also have their own limitations, right? With something called leakage, where you say only up to a certain amount something would end up being relevant for price adjustment. And in the US, I think it is still, although I've seen lockbox there as well, it's still more common to have something called closing accounts, where you actually at closing take another look at where the company is at and then adjust the pricing a little more liberally. I don't know if Mark has anything to add to that.
Sorry, I was coming off mute. I would just echo Ed. I mean, I think US buyers don't use lockboxes. I mean, I think it is completion accounts from a US perspective, and you need to be thoughtful about that up front. You'd have to have a situation where you're in a very strong negotiating position, but I think that is one of the key differences.
I think maybe to give some context here, and Mark, please feel free to jump in, you know, for everybody who's listening. So obviously, in a venture financing round, you would have a valuation of the previous round, and you would have some sort of metric to add on to that and then set the price. And then there might be a little bit of negotiation about that. But obviously in an M&A deal, pricing is the most aggressive and important thing, and where obviously also findings and due diligence will also immediately will be put back onto pricing. So everybody's always talking about the final amount of money that will be owed on the deal. So I think this is sort of where the money's at, right? And then also in terms of how you prepare the diligence and negotiate the price, it's obviously important if you look at the balance sheet of the preceding business year and then just add debt and any cash that you have in the company onto it, and then put some sort of barriers around it for the in a lockbox mechanism, or if you have to see to it that up until the closing, which can be not the same moment as signing, that you're still at risk of the price being adjusted most often rather down than up. Yeah,
I think that brings us quite nicely onto another question from Dan, who asks, well, it's the $1 million question, really. Aside from currency differences and interest rate risks, any tips on getting the best price at exit? Cleo, let's start with you.
Getting the best price. I mean, we did a merge, so I think there's a lot of back and forth on the valuation methodology for the ratio calculation. What I can say is, like, when you're dealing with that kind of thing, you really have to have done your financial due diligence on the assets and the liabilities of the two businesses. So you're comparing apples and apples. I can't say much more than that, but the accounting practices have to align as well.
Hussein?
Cash is more straightforward than shares, equity, and so forth. The big driver will be external driver will be like sell when the market's going up, not in a recession. The internal driver is the same as when you do a VC round. Just make sure the company is firing on all cylinders and you're doing exceptionally well. There are small things that could be done, such as the bank that you want to appoint to do the transfers. Because it's a large quantum, you can negotiate very good exchange rates and fixed fees, where you might have 2/3 of your cap table being US and then a third being UK or European based. It's the numbers add up. So even things of that nature, it kind of requires close attention.
Yeah, for sure. I think this kind of brings us quite nicely towards the final section of this talk. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to chat for a little bit about what comes after M&A. How do you incorporate a new team into your company if you're the purchaser? Mark, you must see this a lot. You must see that a number of companies go through this cultural shift. How does a company do that well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think Hussein touched earlier just generally, you know, how many M&A transactions are really, you know, they're not judged on the moment it signs or the moment it closes. The M&A transaction is judged on the sort of ongoing success and how much the business is integrated, and you know, there can be this huge focus on getting the deal to close without the focus on how you on how you're sort of going to sort of make a success of it post close. I mean, some of it depends on whether you're looking at it from a buy or a sell side. But I mean, if you're looking at a sort of UK European founder team and employee group, I think it's you know, knowing upfront and being thoughtful upfront. I mean, life is about people ultimately. You know, what are the teams that you're going to be integrating into? What are the team leadership look like? Do you have a defined role in those teams, whether you're on the engineering side or talent side or legal side? Quite often you're going to find there's two people who do the same thing. You know, you can't have two CTOs, so people want it's being thoughtful around what that looks like. I mean, if you are selling to a US buyer, you know, frankly, your headquarters is going to be in the US, and you are going to have to get used to a new reporting structure, but trying to understand up front, you know, maybe with buyers that have done multiple acquisitions, it can be really helpful to other companies they've purchased, speak to other founders. I think that's a fair request for a founder to make at the right time in a transaction, to understand how they've dealt with previous teams and what that looks like. Some US buyers can be very hands-off in allowing teams with reporting structures to really be empowered to grow business. Some take really the opposite approach and really want everything to run through the US. But that sort of thing shouldn't be a surprise to you if you've planned properly on the moment it closes. Much of that, I think, is really trying to do your due diligence, whether you're looking at it from a buy or sell side, as you're going through this process.
Edzard, what are the challenges that you see crop up post M&A sometimes at startups?
So, I mean, I think the founders probably have the hardest time dealing with this, because to a certain degree, unless you have like a full-on merge, then some of the team might not even know, right, that the new owner is just a strategic acquirer in the US or something, right? So for the broader team, things might not change all that much effectively, depending on you know, how the acquirer intends to integrate the acquired company. But I think for the founders who, you know, have to then usually have a direct reporting line to the acquirer and who are not sort of can work at their free discretion, that's I think always sort of the hardest thing to chew on. So but essentially, if the founders also, or the founders are driving a process and also involved in picking an acquirer, there's usually I think a best case, obviously there is a sort of understanding also on a cultural level on how the collaboration and integration of the company post M&A is supposed to work. And then I think things usually can go smoothly, but in other cases, you know, the founders are not supposed to stay on forever, but there will be a new management implemented after some sort of integration phase of, let's say, 6 months to 2 years. So everybody knows it's sort of a temporary product. So I think usually they're during the negotiation of post-closing items, especially earnouts for the founders and integration phases, you know, it's quite possible and should be possible to negotiate terms and a climate post M&A that is you know, favorable for both founders and also the rest of the broader team.
Hussein, you're a founder. Was it a struggle post M&A on Photo?
So we brought in a new CEO at the end of 2020 to do the M&A. So I was basically mostly an advisor already. Was it a struggle? Not quite. I our focus post the sale. The sale was in part like a celebration in that the company performance wasn't as good as it was in 2020. So that was it was basically the right time to sell. And the important thing post acquisition was to help bring the team to recognize and work and be essentially conform to like a new culture and a different company and a different culture, and essentially to make it clear that naturally we've now been acquired, so it's upon us to adhere to their culture. And that was different because prior to that is whenever we acquire a company, we have new colleagues joining, it's for them to sort of adapt to ours. And beyond that is to say, this acquirer, our job is now to make sure this is the best return on investment that this company has ever made. And so this isn't the time to like relax on performance. This is time to actually step up and perform even better.
Yeah, makes sense. We've got a couple of minutes left. I want to finish on just going around the room and getting a sense of one piece of advice you'd like to give yourself years ago before you started going through the M&A process. Something you didn't know and wish you had known. Cleo, why don't you kick us off? What do you wish you'd known before you went through your first M&A process?
I think the people side of it, just and the duration. It's just a really tough process to go through, and like I said, it doesn't end when things are signed. The integration is also a really, really tough thing to get through. I think in terms of once the deal's closed, how can you get the integration done as quickly as possible? How can you create a new culture? How can you get people back to business as usual as quickly as possible?
Yeah, for sure. Edzard?
I think I can sort of co-sign on that. I think, there are a lot of aspects to this, but effectively it's people. And I mean, M&A can have a bad name. Essentially, something good can come out of it if you sell it the right way to everybody involved. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of, what also legal advisors don't see because it's post-closing and so it's purely internal, that you see that you sort of send the right message to everybody. And then I think a merger can also, become very, very, can just be a very good thing if you start right.
Mark?
Yeah, I'm on a slightly different track as someone who's done hundreds of M&A transactions as an advisor over 25 years actually now. But I mean, I think one thing I still always feel is we've got this super UK European tech ecosystem, and I still see companies, I think, as the humble advisor, selling too early. I think this was touched on by Hussein and Cleo at the start, but I think so many European companies get the 20 million, the 50 million, the 100 million exit. It's amazing. It's a life-changing amount of money. I get all of that. But US companies want the $1 billion or the $10 billion or the $20 billion. So I think if I was going back to talk to founders over the years, it would be maybe just that hope that we start to see some of those bigger, braver UK European companies really, really grow and get some rockstar exits and do some acquisitions on their way through.
Hussein, we've got seconds left. What's the one piece of advice you wish you'd seen?
At the risk of sounding spiritual, it's not the destination, it's the journey. Build such a special company that you'd never want to sell. If any of your investors need the liquidity, just help them find a buyer. But the goal ought not to be to sell.
Always good to finish on a spiritual point. That is about all we've got time for. Thanks to Cleo, Hussein, Mark, Edzard for sharing your thoughts. To all of you at home for coming along, and Taylor Wessing for partnering. The next Sifted Talks is a particularly exciting one. It's our first in-person talks, and it'll take place at Riverstone Heights in East London on the 12th of September. It'll be digging into how startups can ensure their employees have work-life balance. And if you want more IRL Sifted, there's good news for you. The Sifted Summit will be taking place on the 2nd to 3rd of October at Magazine in London. It'll bring together 3,000 founders, startup operators, and investors under one roof. You can head to sifted.summit.eu to find out more. Thanks again and goodbye.